On August 25th, 2026, the world lost Dolly Parton. She was 80 years old, and her family said she died peacefully in Nashville after a brief battle with cancer, surrounded by loved ones. It came just 17 months after the death of her husband, Carl Dean, who passed away in March of 2025 at the age of 82, following a long and largely private battle with declining health. Which means that as of this video, both halves of one of the strangest, most talked about, most rumored over marriages in American entertainment history are now gone. For nearly 60 years, the public asked the same question about Dolly Parton and Carl Dean, in one form or another. Was this actually a real marriage, or was it something else entirely? Was Carl Dean even real, given how rarely he was seen? Was Dolly's endlessly quotable openness about flirting with other men, about an actual affair she once had, about a decades-long best friendship the tabloids swore was something more, a sign that the marriage was, in some fundamental way, more arrangement than romance? Or was it, as Dolly herself insisted again and again for 6 decades, the single most solid, unshakable relationship of her entire extraordinary life? It's a question worth asking honestly, not cynically. Dolly Parton spent her entire career being underestimated. Dismissed early on as just a big wig and a big voice, before decades of songwriting, business savvy, and philanthropy proved otherwise. It would be easy, and more than a little unfair, to apply that same reflexive skepticism to her marriage, simply because it didn't look like the marriages most celebrities perform for the cameras. The far more interesting question isn't whether it looked normal, it's whether it was true. Now that both of them are gone, we finally have the whole story, beginning to end. And it is, honestly, stranger, more complicated and more moving than the tabloid version ever let on. It starts, like a lot of the best country songs do, in a laundromat. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who wants the real story behind the headlines on Hollywood's biggest names, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us who you want us to cover next. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. Now let's go back to a laundromat in Nashville in 1964. The laundromat. Dolly Parton arrived in Nashville in the summer of 1964, 18 years old, fresh out of high school in the Tennessee mountains, carrying exactly the kind of big, impossible dream that Nashville has watched thousands of teenagers arrive with over the decades. On her very first day in the city, before she had even unpacked, she walked into a laundromat called the Wishy-Washy to do her wash. A tall, dark-haired young man was there too. He struck up a conversation. He looked at her face while he talked to her, which, Dolly would later say, struck her immediately because so few men bothered to do that. His name was Carl Thomas Dean. He was 21, worked in his family's asphalt paving business, and had absolutely nothing to do with the music industry. Dolly had just moved 400 miles to conquer. By his own account, he knew almost instantly. He would later say his first thought upon seeing her was that he was going to marry that girl, and his second thought was simply that she was good-looking. It's the kind of meet-cute that sounds almost too tidy to be true. The small-town girl and the local boy, love at first sight outside a laundromat on the very first day of her new life. But, by every account either of them ever gave, in dozens of interviews, stretched across 60 years, that is exactly how it happened. Carl had a 2-year commitment to the U.S. Army National Guard to finish first, so their courtship played out over roughly 2 years, mostly out of the public eye, which, as it turned out, would become the defining pattern of their entire relationship. What's easy to miss, looking back at that laundromat story from the vantage point of Dolly Parton's eventual global fame, is how genuinely ordinary the whole thing was at the time. She wasn't a star yet. She was an 18-year-old with a suitcase and a guitar, and Carl had no reason whatsoever to know she'd amount to anything more than a pretty girl doing her laundry. Whatever he fell for in that parking lot, it wasn't the persona the world would eventually know. It was just her. That distinction, a man who loved Dolly Parton before there was a Dolly Parton brand to love, became one of the central pillars of how she talked about their marriage for the rest of her life. A wedding no one was supposed to see. On Memorial Day, May 30th, 1966, Dolly and Carl drove across the state line to Ringgold, Georgia, and got married. The entire guest list consisted of 3 people: Dolly's mother, Evie Lee Parton, the preacher, and the preacher's wife. Evie Lee doubled as the wedding photographer. There was no reception, no honeymoon. Dolly had radio commitments waiting for her back in Nashville, and by her own account, she was up early the very next morning to make one of them. The secrecy wasn't romantic paranoia. It was strategic. Dolly's label at the time didn't want its rising young female star to be publicly married, on the theory that it might dull her appeal. So for roughly a full year, Dolly and Carl kept the marriage almost entirely hidden, so effectively that her own label executive, Fred Foster, reportedly had no idea his artist had a husband until word eventually got around. When he found out, watching her career take off anyway, he apparently cracked that she should be glad she hadn't gotten married after all, not realizing she already had. It was, in other words, a marriage built on secrecy from day one. Not because there was anything to hide about the relationship itself, but because the music industry Dolly was trying to break into had very specific ideas about what a marketable young star should look like. That tension between what the public was allowed to see and what was actually true would define the entire next 6 decades. The man who disappeared. Here is the fact that, more than any other, fed decades of tabloid speculation. Carl Dean was almost never seen in public. Not occasionally seen. Almost never. As Dolly's fame exploded through the late 1960s and into the 70s, 80s, and beyond, as she became a Grammy winner, a movie star, the face of an entire theme park, one of the most recognized entertainers on the planet, her husband simply declined to be part of any of it. He didn't attend the awards shows. He didn't do the red carpets. He didn't sit for the magazine profiles. By multiple accounts, Carl had not been photographed in public at all for roughly 4 decades when, in December of 2019, a fan happened to catch him running an errand at a post office near the couple's home outside Nashville. That grainy, unremarkable photograph of a silver-haired man in his 70s buying stamps became, briefly, genuine national news because it was proof, to a public that had spent decades half joking that Carl Dean might not actually exist, that he was real. Dolly leaned into the mystery with humor rather than fighting it. She'd joke about the rumors herself, and she was candid, in the rare interviews where his name came up, about exactly what kind of person she'd married. A homebody who genuinely didn't want the spotlight, who preferred trading cars and land back home to sitting through an awards ceremony in a tuxedo. She once told People magazine that if she called him, that was fine. He wasn't expecting it. And that he didn't much like having her home for long stretches because it interfered with his own routines. It wasn't coldness. It was, by her account, simply 2 extremely different people who had figured out very early on how to let each other be exactly who they were. One of the only outsiders who ever actually got a real glimpse of Carl at home was the veteran country music journalist Alan Nash, who spent 2 full days interviewing Dolly inside the couple's Nashville house back in 1977 for a magazine cover story. By Nash's own later account, Carl was initially standoffish. She overheard him telling Dolly flatly that he didn't want to do any interviews. But he eventually wandered in to tend the fire, cracking a dry joke at the 2 women for talking so long they were practically growing roots into the furniture. Nash came away describing him as shy, rugged, and unexpectedly funny once he let his guard down. A rare, 3-dimensional glimpse of a man the public otherwise only knew as a rumor. That near-total invisibility is exactly what turned Carl Dean over the decades into something close to an urban legend. Fans and journalists genuinely joked at various points that Dolly might have invented him entirely, that there was no husband at all, just a convenient cover story for a country star who needed one. Dolly found the whole thing funny rather than insulting. She'd bring him up casually in interviews, share the occasional decades-old photo, and let the mystery simply exist, rather than mounting some kind of public relations campaign to prove her husband was a real flesh-and-blood person. It's a strange kind of trust, if you think about it. Trusting that a marriage doesn't need to be photographed to be true. The Porter Wagner years. If Carl's near-total absence from public life planted the first seeds of speculation about the marriage, Dolly's professional partnership with country star Porter Wagoner planted the second. In 1967, a year after her secret wedding, 21-year-old Dolly joined the Porter Wagoner show as his singing partner, and the two spent the next 7 years performing tightly harmonized duets on television and on record that radiated a kind of romantic chemistry that country audiences ate up. It didn't take long for rumors to start that the chemistry wasn't just an act. People assumed, in Dolly's own later words, that she and Wagoner were basically a married couple. By her account, Carl handled the gossip with a shrug rather than jealousy. She recalled him essentially saying that if people wanted to believe she was living with Porter, they could go ahead and believe it, because he knew the truth, and that was enough for him. Dolly herself was later blunt about why she never crossed that line, no matter how close the professional bond became. She didn't believe she could have kept up a genuine affair and hidden it from a husband she loved for years on end. "You can fake a feeling for a little while," she once said. "You can't fake it for 7 years. The partnership eventually curdled anyway. Not romantically, but professionally. When Dolly decided to leave the show in 1974 to build her own solo career, Wagoner reportedly tried to talk her out of it, warning her that her label would drop her the moment she walked away from his platform. She left regardless, and the fallout escalated all the way to a 1979 lawsuit, with Wagoner suing her for a reported $3 million over what he considered a breach of their business arrangement. It was, by any measure, an ugly, protracted falling out between two people who had once seemed inseparable on stage. Dolly herself later acknowledged the ambiguity at the heart of it all, admitting there was a real possibility Wagoner had genuine romantic feelings for her, even if she never returned them the same way. "Maybe he was in love with me," she said years later, "but it was a love of its kind. It was not a love that could ever be shared." That kind of unresolved, one-sided intensity, real enough to fuel a hit song, real enough to fuel a lawsuit, but never crossing into an actual affair, is a large part of why the Wagoner rumors never fully died down, even decades after both of their careers had moved in completely different directions. And yet the song that came out of that breakup is one of the most famous love songs ever written. Dolly composed "I Will Always Love You" specifically for Porter, as a way of telling him goodbye without a screaming match. And by her account, when she sat down and sang it for him directly, it moved him to tears on the spot. The two eventually reconciled years later. Dolly was reportedly by his side the day he died in 2007, and she sang the very same song one more time at his funeral. Whatever the two of them actually were to each other, romantic rumor or not, it was clearly something that mattered enormously to both of them until the very end. Men are my weakness. Here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated than either the tabloid version or the greeting card version of Dolly and Carl's marriage. Because Dolly herself, across dozens of interviews over the decades, described their relationship using a word that tends to raise eyebrows: open. She was careful every single time to clarify exactly what she meant by it. "Yes, it's an open relationship," she once explained, "but not sexually." What she meant was that both she and Carl gave each other permission to notice other people, to flirt, to enjoy a harmless crush, without either of them treating it as a threat to the marriage. "He's not jealous, and I'm not jealous of him," she said. "He knows I flirt. He flirts too." In a candid 1982 interview with Barbara Walters, Dolly admitted flatly that she and Carl were both flirts, and that she stayed faithful best I know how. An oddly qualified phrase that tabloids seized on for years afterward. She elaborated in the same conversation. "There are good-looking men who come on to her pretty strongly," she said, "and every now and then she likes to come on pretty strongly herself. But she knew she had something at home she wasn't willing to risk losing for anything in the world." Over the years, she'd name a fairly public list of celebrity crushes, including Sylvester Stallone, her Rhinestone co-star Burt Reynolds, and country singer Keith Urban, treating the whole subject with the same wink and a grin openness she brought to almost everything else about her public persona. There's even a domestic version of this openness baked directly into one of her most famous songs. Jolene, the pleading, desperate ballad about a woman begging a beautiful redhead not to steal her man, wasn't born out of some grand betrayal. Dolly explained decades later that it grew out of a real, mostly harmless situation. A bank teller near their home had developed an obvious crush on Carl, and he, by Dolly's own telling, loved going to the bank specifically because of the attention. It became a running joke between them. Dolly needling him about spending awfully long stretches of time at a bank they didn't have that much money in. An innocent flirtation turned into one of the most enduring songs in American music. If nothing else, it's proof that Dolly Parton could take the small, everyday frictions of a long marriage and turn them into something the whole world would still be singing along to half a century later. It's worth pointing out how unusual this level of candor actually was for a country star of Dolly's generation, working in an industry and an era that generally rewarded wholesome silence over honesty about a marriage's messier textures. Most of her peers, especially the women, learned early to present their home lives as spotless and uncomplicated, regardless of what was actually happening behind closed doors. Dolly did something close to the opposite. She talked about flirting, about attraction to other men, about the specific boundaries she and Carl had negotiated decades before it became remotely normal for a public figure to discuss a marriage in those terms. Whether that openness reads as refreshingly honest or as its own kind of carefully managed persona probably depends on how much you're inclined to trust her. But it was at minimum consistent, the exact same story in the exact same words across nearly 50 years of interviews. If you're finding this as fascinating as we did putting it together, the real, messy, human details behind a marriage most people only knew from the outside, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help more people find stories like this one. Because, as open and playful as all of that flirting sounds, there was one chapter of this marriage that genuinely tested it. The affair of the heart. In the early 1980s, at what should have been the absolute peak of her career, she was fresh off 9 to 5, about to release The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, becoming a bona fide movie star on top of a music icon. Dolly Parton was, by her own account, quietly fallen apart. She'd received death threats serious enough to cancel a tour. She was dealing with painful, ongoing health problems. And in the middle of all of it, she became genuinely, deeply involved, emotionally, with someone who wasn't her husband. Dolly later described it in her own words as an affair of the heart, a phrase she chose carefully, distinct from a purely physical affair, though by her own telling it was real enough to devastate her when it ended. It had long been rumored in music circles that the man in question was her bandleader at the time, Greg Perry, though Dolly herself was never fully explicit about naming him publicly. What she was explicit about was the aftermath. The guilt over having genuinely fallen for someone else while still married to Carl left her, by her own written account years later, at one of the lowest points of her entire life, wrestling with genuinely dark thoughts about whether she wanted to go on living at all. She has said she doesn't believe she would have actually gone through with it, but she has also said plainly that the despair was real, and that it took real effort, including support she credited to her Christian faith and to the people closest to her, to climb back out of that hole. It's a genuinely sobering chapter to sit with, especially set against the cheerful, rhinestone-covered public image she spent a career cultivating. It's also, in its own way, proof that the marriage everyone loved to gossip about was carrying real emotional weight, enough to nearly break both the woman living it and, evidently, not enough to actually end it. It's a striking thing, in hindsight, that Dolly chose to reveal this chapter of her own life at all, decades after the fact, in a business that generally rewards keeping the darkest moments permanently buried. She could easily have let the affair remain nothing more than a rumor, whispered about a bandleader, never officially confirmed or denied. Instead, she put her own account of it into print, in her own words, effectively closing the door on decades of speculation about whether the rumor was true, while still protecting deliberately, the exact identity and full details of what had actually happened. It's a very particular kind of honesty, candid enough to satisfy the public record, private enough to still be hers. Because Dolly and Carl stayed together. She never said publicly whether Carl knew the full extent of the affair at the time or only learned the details later when she wrote about it decades afterward. What's certain is that whatever reckoning happened between them stayed exactly as private as everything else in their marriage, and that 6 decades later they were still married when he died. The Judy Ogle rumors. The other rumor that followed Dolly Parton for essentially her entire adult life had nothing to do with Carl Dean at all. It was about her closest friend, Judy Ogle. Dolly and Judy met as children, in the 3rd or 4th grade, growing up in the same corner of the Tennessee mountains. Judy followed Dolly to Nashville not long after Dolly herself arrived, and the two remained inseparable for the rest of Dolly's life. 60-plus years of friendship, much of it spent literally traveling together, sharing hotel rooms on the road, with Dolly casually calling Judy her girlfriend in the old-fashioned platonic sense of the word. That closeness, combined with the culture's persistent difficulty imagining that two women could be that intimate without it being romantic, generated decades of tabloid speculation that Judy was secretly Dolly's real partner, and that the marriage to Carl was some kind of cover. Dolly addressed it head-on, repeatedly, across interviews spanning decades. People say that because you can't really have a great relationship with a woman, she told The Sun in one particularly candid 2019 interview, "I'm not gay, but I have so many gay friends and I accept everybody for who they are." She'd point out, with a laugh, that people said the exact same thing about Oprah Winfrey and her best friend Gayle King, as though two devoted female friends were inherently suspicious. In her own memoir, years earlier, Dolly had already put it about as plainly as language allows. Plenty of hotel rooms, she wrote, had a bed that never got slept in when she and Judy traveled together, and people were welcome to wonder about that all they liked. But the two of them had never been lovers. Just, in her words, pure, sweet, fun-loving friends. It's a rumor that never fully died, precisely because Dolly herself never seemed embarrassed or defensive about the closeness that fueled it. She simply kept living exactly the way she wanted to, and let the speculation say more about the people doing the speculating than about her. What Carl actually thought. Through every single one of these chapters, the Porter Wagoner rumors, the flirting with celebrities, the affair of the heart, the endless Judy Ogle speculation, one figure remained almost entirely, deliberately silent: Carl Dean himself. He essentially never gave interviews. He never publicly responded to a single rumor about his own marriage. Everything we know about how he actually felt comes filtered entirely through what Dolly chose to share about him. And by her account, consistently, across 60 years of interviews, he simply wasn't a jealous or insecure man. "He's very secure within himself," she told Parade in 2015. "He's never been jealous." She described the two of them as being, in her words, completely opposite. An outgoing, glittering entertainer married to a quiet homebody who preferred trading cars to walking a red carpet, and insisted that the contrast was exactly what made the marriage work, rather than what threatened it. "We're completely opposite," she said, "but that's what makes it fun. I never know what he's going to say or do. He's always surprising me." It's worth sitting with how unusual that dynamic really was, especially by the standards of a music industry that has swallowed up countless marriages under far less pressure. Dolly Parton spent 6 decades as one of the most famous, most photographed, most gossiped about women on the planet. Carl Dean spent those same 6 decades running an asphalt company and trading cars in relative anonymity a few miles outside Nashville, apparently entirely content to let his wife have the spotlight to herself. Whether that counts as an unusually secure man or an unusually convenient arrangement probably depends on how cynical you're inclined to be. But by every scrap of evidence either of them ever left behind, it was a genuine, mutually agreed-upon way of living. Not a cover story either one of them was straining to maintain. 50 years, then a wedding they finally got. In 2016, 50 years after their 3-witness elopement in Ringgold, Georgia, Dolly and Carl finally had the wedding they'd never gotten to have the first time around. It was still private, held quietly at their home, with only a small circle of family and friends. But this time, Dolly got to wear the elaborate gown she'd always dreamed of, and Carl, by her account, cleaned up looking like a handsome dude out of Hollywood. The milestone anniversary directly inspired an entire album, Pure and Simple, released that same year, built around the different textures of a lifelong love, including a song called Forever Love, written specifically to accompany their renewed vows. Dolly told Rolling Stone at the time that she'd spent the writing process thinking through all the different colors love takes on over the course of a real lifetime together, rather than the single, simple shade most love songs settle for. It's a small, quietly moving detail, in hindsight. 50 years into a marriage that had survived secrecy, tabloid rumors, an affair, and 6 decades of a husband who almost never appeared in public, Dolly Parton still wanted the wedding day she'd never gotten. And Carl Dean, the man who avoided cameras for 40 straight years, showed up for it. The last chapter. By the early 2020s, the man who had spent 60 years as a private, elusive homebody was fading in a much more painful way. Reports indicate Carl had been quietly dealing with health issues for years and passed away at their home in Nashville on March 3, 2025, at the age of 82, with family reporting that Dolly was by his side until the very end. What had always been a famously private marriage became, in its final years, a private act of caregiving. According to people close to the couple, Carl's decline eventually reached the point where he required constant care. He died at their home in Nashville on March 3, 2025, at the age of 82, with his family, according to reports close to Dolly, saying she was the one keeping vigil at his side until the very end. Carl and I spent many wonderful years together, Dolly wrote in the statement announcing his death. Words can't do justice to the love we shared for over 60 years. Thank you for your prayers and sympathy. He was buried in a private ceremony, survived by Dolly and his 2 siblings, exactly as private in death as he had spent his entire life trying to be. It's worth pausing on just how consistent that final act of privacy was, with everything that came before it. Here was a man who had spent 60 years deliberately avoiding cameras, deliberately staying out of a spotlight his wife had more than enough of for both of them. And even at the very end, the family kept his funeral small, private, and shielded from public view, exactly the way he'd always seemed to want it. If the entire marriage really had been some kind of elaborate arrangement, rather than a genuine partnership, it's hard to imagine why anyone would have bothered maintaining that level of discretion right up through a funeral. Nobody but immediate family was ever going to see. Dolly's first public appearance after losing him came less than 2 weeks later, at Dollywood's 40th anniversary celebration, a park built quite literally on the fortune her marriage to Carl had helped fund from behind the scenes for decades. Of course I will always love him, and I'll miss him, she told the crowd, but I wanted you to know that I will always love you. It was, whether she intended it that way or not, an echo of the very song she'd written half a century earlier for an entirely different chapter of her life. Except this time, there was no ambiguity at all about who she meant. By her own later admission, the year and a half that followed Carl's death took a toll on her that she hadn't fully reckoned with while she was busy caring for him. Just days before her own death, she talked about dealing with health issues she simply hadn't paid attention to while she was watching over Carl. On August 25, 2026, 17 months after burying the man she'd met outside a laundromat 62 years earlier, Dolly Parton died in Nashville after a brief battle with cancer. Her family's statement said she was surrounded by loved ones, and that in her final moments they believed she was already back in the arms of the people she'd lost, Carl included. So, sweet love story or something else? Here's what the full record actually shows, now that there's nothing left to speculate about and no one left alive to ask directly. It shows a marriage that was, by any reasonable definition, unconventional. A husband who spent 60 years almost entirely out of public view, so thoroughly that his own wife's fans half joked he might not exist. a wife who was remarkably candid for a country music icon of her generation, about finding other men attractive, about flirting, about a self-described open relationship that she insisted, repeatedly and specifically, never crossed into physical infidelity. A genuine emotional affair in the early 1980s that nearly broke her, and that she chose ultimately not to let break the marriage. Decades of rumors about Porter Wagoner, about Judy Ogle, that she met not with panic or denial dressed up as outrage, but with humor, patience, and a consistent, unwavering refusal to let other people's gossip dictate how she lived. And it shows something else too, something that's much harder to fake than a public image. A woman who quietly stepped away from the biggest stage in American entertainment to personally care for her husband as his health slipped away, who sat with him at the very end, who buried him in near total privacy exactly as he'd have wanted, and who then, by her own account, spent the last year and a half of her own life carrying a grief and an exhaustion she never fully recovered from. One that ended, in the end, barely 17 months after his did. So, sweet love story or something else? Based on everything Dolly Parton and Carl Dean ever said, did, and ultimately lived out until the very last chapter of both of their lives, the honest answer might be both at once. It was unconventional. It was, by Dolly's own description, complicated in ways a lot of marriages never have to be. It survived an affair, decades of rumor, and a level of separateness that would have ended most relationships in Nashville or anywhere else. But it also unmistakably endured. Through fame most people can't even imagine, through tragedy, through a devastating illness, right up until neither one of them was left to keep telling the story. Whatever else it was real. And now it's over, for both of them, together, the way it apparently always was, underneath all the rumors, quietly, privately, and on their own terms. Maybe that's the real lesson buried underneath 60 years of tabloid headlines and half-serious conspiracy theories about a man who supposedly didn't exist. Dolly Parton, of all people. A woman who built an entire empire out of turning her own life into open, glittering, oversized public spectacle, chose to keep exactly one part of it small, quiet, and mostly hers. Not because she had something to hide, but because some things she seemed to understand better than almost anyone else in her industry ever has. Only stay real if you don't let the whole world help you carry them. If this changed how you think about one of country music's most talked about marriages, let us know down in the comments. We read everyone, and they genuinely shape what we cover next. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. Rest in peace, Dolly and Carl. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.